begin our program, we're going to have opening remarks from the Consul General's office. We are honored that Consul for Public Diplomacy, Carmel Halevi, has joined us this evening. Carmel is new to Los Angeles, just the first couple of months. She spent weeks. You know where you are? No. She spent the last 2 years as Deputy Chief of Mission at the Consulate General of Israel within China. Before joining the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, practiced commercial law, served in the IDF, attaining the rank of captain, lives in Hernana, so it might be your neighbor. And we're honored to have Consul for the Public Diplomacy, Carmel Halevi.
Hello, shalom, everyone. Thank you, Rabbi, for the introduction. I would like to recognize Ambassador Dan Shapiro, Rabbi David Wolpe, Max Webb, Senior Rabbi of Sinai Temple and the Sinai Temple Israel Center, Rabbi May, Rabbi Erez Sherman. Dear all, I'm very happy to be with you this evening, and I'm very excited. As Rabbi mentioned, I just arrived to LA 2 weeks ago as my second post at the Consulate General here in Los Angeles. I would like to start my remarks with a quote. My presence here today reminds us of the lessons that history teaches us and the great responsibility we have to practice tolerance for the sake of building our communities and societies. We must take brave steps to build a bridge of a real peace for future generations. This was said a few days ago by Sheikh Abdallah bin Zayed at Yad Vashem during his visit to Israel, remarking the 2 years anniversary for the Abraham Accords. It was a powerful moment. The signing of the Accords marked the beginning of a new chapter in the Middle East. It represents a decision to build a future together that will benefit all of our peoples. As Prime Minister Lapid stated during his remarks alongside President Biden in Jerusalem, here in the Middle East, we have an alternative. It is growing and gaining power. We are creating an alliance of moderate countries that believe in peace, that believe that our children deserve the opportunity for a better life. Ladies and gentlemen, the Abraham Accords represent a revolutionary kind of peace, filtering down from national leaders to every aspect of society. As a little girl growing up in Israel, I could only imagine to travel to Dubai, Abu Dhabi, or Bahrain. And now, almost 500,000 of Israeli tourists have already traveled there. The Negev Summit, the Israeli Pavilion at the 2020 Dubai Expo, the high-level visits, 34 agreements that have been signed between Israel and the UAE, and 24 with Bahrain. Billion that has been increasing the trade, the visit of Aviv Kochavi, the Israeli Chief of Staff of the IDF, to Morocco, and so on and so on. We can continue being practical and talk with numbers, but I believe that in this case, the whole is greater than some of its parts. Peace begets peace, and the Accords open the door to additional peace agreements. They pave the way to that goal and serve to effectively consolidate the moderate forces in the Middle East. So I would like to thank you again, and I'll take this opportunity to wish you all Shana Tova, Happy New Year, and peace will be upon us all. Amen.
Daniel Shapiro has had a diverse career of over 20 years in senior foreign policy and national security positions in the U.S. government. In July of 2011, he was appointed U.S. Ambassador to Israel by President Barack Obama and held that position till the end of the Obama administration. He won praise from leaders of both the United States and Israel for his deft management of the U.S.-Israel relationship. Among his major contributions were negotiating $38 billion memorandum of understanding for U.S. military aid to Israel, unprecedented public outreach in fluent Hebrew to Israel's diverse communities, and a 40% growth in U.S.-Israel trade. He participated prior to that in Special Envoy George Mitchell's team and led U.S. diplomatic efforts in Syria and Lebanon, and advised President Obama through the Arab Spring of 2011. His remarkable breadth of insights has been featured across major media networks, and his writing has appeared in Foreign Policy, The Atlantic, The Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, Israeli Channel 2, and more. He holds degrees from both Brandeis University and Harvard University, and currently lives in Ra'anana, Israel, with his wife, Julie Fisher, and their 3 daughters. Ambassador Dan Shapiro.
First of all, it's a pleasure to have you. And often you can prepare a lot of questions, but then something comes up that you have to ask or share. And both Honorable Greenblatt and Ambassador Shapiro spoke to our middle school students when they were here. And to hear the students ask questions that both of you said they never heard in press conferences really impressed both of you. But one child asked you today, what was it like to be a Jew in these sometimes hostile Arab countries? And you shared a story about Syria that I'd love for you to begin with, what it was like to be in the hotel.
Early in the Obama administration, President Obama was making an attempt, it was ultimately unsuccessful, to see if we could somewhat normalize our relationship with Syria. He had said in the campaign he would at least make an effort to try to do outreach to countries that we had had tensions with. And he sent, under the first mission, myself and another colleague, a former ambassador to Lebanon, Jeff Feltman, to Syria to have the first dialogues with Bashar Assad and his government. There was a meeting in the choice of us. Ambassador Feltman, Ambassador Lebanon, signaled to the Syrians that we were watching what was going on in Lebanon, and Daniel Shapiro, the president's advisor on Israel matters, signaled that the Syrians should take seriously our concerns about Israel. So we had our discussions. They weren't very fruitful, but I thought, in the hotel at night, I can find another way of punctuating this. It was on a Tuesday or Wednesday, and that coming Shabbat, we were having a Simchat Bat for our daughter, who we had recently adopted, and I needed to read Torah. I needed to lane in shul. I needed to practice my laning. So I took out the tikkun to start to practice. And, they tell you as an American official, when you go to a foreign government, particularly an unfriendly foreign government, you should assume that your hotel room is bugged. You should assume that somebody's listening to everything that goes on in there. So I thought I'd treat whoever was listening, the Syrian intelligence official, to the Parsha as I prepared for my daughter's laning. And at least they let me on the plane the next day. So,
And so that's let's say, more humorous story, but of something more serious, because now we're 21 years after 9/11, and Taliban's back in Afghanistan. But at the same time that's happening, we have these other Arab countries coming together to use the word normalization, but the Abraham Accords. Could you imagine 21 years ago, thinking back to where you were at that moment, realizing that, oh my gosh, one day these countries who, not even thinking about normalization, but Israel wasn't in their vocabulary, are coming together to seek common interest?
No, that was not on my agenda. I mentioned earlier that someone who devotes their career to the Middle East has a lot of hardships or hard days. A lot of putting out fires, a lot of responding to negative things, a lot of trying to prevent bad things from happening, a lot of banging your heads against brick walls. Actually, I got into public service to try to help advance Israeli-Palestinian peace. It was early in the Oslo Accords period when things looked hopeful. That may be the last time I can remember a really hopeful period, and it quickly deteriorated. I stayed in public service because of 9/11. I was working in the Capitol on that day. We knew shortly after the towers fell that the Capitol knew then that my responsibility was to try to help create a better and more peaceful region and prevent those threats from affecting the United States and our children and our allies. So I spent most of the next couple of decades really trying to help address those concerns, ensure Israel had the means to defend itself with Iron Dome, with a big $38 billion military assistance package that was signed. To try to advance peace talks with the Palestinians, again, head against a brick wall. But not really on the agenda was the idea that several Arab states would take it upon themselves to step forward and say, we are tired of sublimating our interests to a stalemate. And rather than adhere to a sequence that says only after the Israeli-Palestinian issue is totally solved will we begin to normalize relations with Israel, we will begin now to treat Israel as a legitimate, normal country, have a peace agreement, have full relations with them, exchange ambassadors, begin commerce and tourism and trade. And that is a wonderful thing, to finally have, maybe the first time in the last 30 years, something really positive to focus on, throwing myself at it in my current professional work.
So you said that they took it upon themselves. Is there an inflection point that these countries, either singularly or as a group, said, it's time? Or was it a conglomeration of both the external threats of Iran, for instance, or was it saying, we can do this, there are common interests that both can help us, and who cares about the others?
The external threat of Iran was definitely a source of pulling Israel and these Arab states, particularly in the Gulf, together. But that didn't require normalization. Already for several years, even when I was in government, Israel and UAE officials would meet quietly in hotel rooms in Washington. There were security channels, intelligence channels. They had means of coordinating to deal with the common threats they faced. It was a different order decision to bring this out in the open. And some people have asked, well, why didn't it happen earlier? And I actually think among the reasons was that it required a generational shift of leadership in the Arab world. The Saudi king, Abdullah, previous king, led the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which set out this sequence of first two states with Palestinians and only then normalization. And he lived well into his 90s and served as king until 2015. I think it was unthinkable that any Arab leader, and certainly the Saudis themselves, or the UAE, so closely identified with the Saudis, would break with that consensus and that sequence while he was still alive. So there was a shift. Another Saudi king came in of the same generation, King Salman, but quickly with a new and young and very influential and somewhat maybe iconoclastic in good and maybe not as good ways, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, with the UAE leadership of a different generation also emerging. And I think they understood their interests differently, and they were tired of waiting for a breakthrough that never seemed to come. And of course, they had a good relationship with the Trump administration, and I want to give credit to Jason Greenblatt and his colleagues and those in the administration who worked on that issue, who helped create an atmosphere in which that was more likely. But then there was another interesting breakthrough moment when Israel was considering, in the summer of 2020, annexing part of the West Bank in a way that, in my judgment, would have probably made a two-state solution with the Palestinians impossible. That was the moment the UAE decided to step forward and say, we believe Israel is a friend and an opportunity, and we can normalize our relationship, but it can't be done at the same time that annexation of the West Bank is happening. They argued that doing this was a way to preserve a two-state solution. So there are a lot of different factors: generational shift, Iran, of course, in the background, and then that critical moment of the Palestinian issue.
So there's two areas. There's top down and there's outside in. So let's start top down first, because in terms of the other Arab countries, you're saying that the top, in terms of the leadership, really changed their focus, and obviously it led to the peoples. And it seems like there's this dichotomy between the leaders and then the peoples. Is that possible within the Palestinian leadership? As I've heard you speak a couple of times today, you said, you know what, right now, just no. Is that possible? And if it is, not today, but maybe however long down the road, are there either names or people that you see on the ground that want that change also from the top?
I don't have much hope that the current Palestinian leadership is capable of this type of a rethink of their interests. Certainly we know the leadership in Gaza, which is a terrorist organization, Hamas, rejects Israel's very existence. That's not going to come from them. But I say with sadness that I think it's also true of the Palestinian Authority leadership in Ramallah, that they, at least President Abbas, at this stage of his life and his political career, he's not going to take those risks. He's not going to change the narrative that he has stuck to all of these years. He viewed the recognition of Israel, the normalization, as a betrayal of the Palestinian cause. Said so, withdrew his ambassadors from those countries, maybe later sent them back, but there's a general rejection to this approach. And I say that with great sadness because I think the Palestinian people deserve a chance to participate in and benefit from and contribute to the positive changes that are happening because of normalization. If there is one source of potential positive energy into the Israeli-Palestinian arena, it is the Abraham Accords. Right now, because of the Palestinian leadership and frankly because of the political mess and instability in Israel, an election every 6 or 9 months, there's not a lot of room for any kind of negotiation between those two parties. But what you do have are Arab states who still adhere to the idea that they want to see a two-state solution, consider themselves friends of the Palestinian people, if not necessarily happy with their leaders, who are also building warm relations with Israel and could be a catalyst to getting Palestinians to benefit and participate in that, but also have a different kind of conversation, one that Israelis will really listen to, saying, we're your friends, we're building our relationship, it's warm, it's people to people, it's trade, it's everything you've wanted, and don't forget, we also think the Palestinian issue still needs to be addressed. That could be a source of positive energy. But for the Palestinians to really take advantage of it, it probably will take a shift in leadership. I have some ideas of some very smart and very thoughtful and worldly Palestinian people of a different generation in the business community, in the technology community, who I would love to see emerge into positions of political influence. They haven't really been permitted to. I think if I named them, it would only harm their prospects, so I won't do that. But
Heard first at Sinai Temple.
but I do think the potential is there for a different Palestinian leadership once that leadership change takes place.
And so you mentioned sort of secret channels that were happening in these countries before the official Abraham Accords. Have you seen, or can you mention some of those channels that might be actually occurring within the Palestinian-Israeli conversation or relationship?
Well, there are plenty of channels. Palestinians have negotiated with Israel for years, and of course the security cooperation between the Palestinian Authority and Israel continues to be fairly positive. It's not perfect, but it has prevented many acts of terror. It has prevented deaths on both sides. So, we know there is some ability to talk to each other. There are even people in the Palestinian business community who have built relations with their Israeli counterparts. There are Israeli companies, high-tech companies and American multinationals that have a base of operations in Israel that are setting up incubators and setting up R&D centers in Rawabi, in Ramallah, in Palestinian cities, trying to find a way to help that Palestinian community get connected globally and emerge as a channel of communication. So those exist, but there remains a very heavy overlay of rejection of the idea of normalization. Normalization is sort of a dirty word in the Palestinian community, even to the point of sort of very harmless people-to-people initiatives, soccer games and choruses and children's summer camps. Sometimes it's viewed as a betrayal to participate in those. So there does need to be a breakdown of that kind of rejection.
Before we go on to the next question, if you have questions as well, Gary Feynman's in the back. He's waving his hand back there. He has note cards, so you can ask for a note card. You can write a question, and then Gary will bring them up, and we'll sift through those as well. How about the Israeli Arab population? How are they viewing the Abraham Accords, both from the outside and then also looking on the inside in terms of their own brothers and sisters?
I don't think Israeli Arabs have yet fully taken advantage or maybe been fully drawn into the opportunities represented by the Abraham Accords, but the potential there is enormous. If you talk about a bridge, a community that is, for the most part, fully Israeli, they have their critiques, they have their complaints, some still have some rejection of Israel, but the vast majority, I think, at least of the younger generation, view themselves as Israeli citizens, proudly so, and really they don't expect anything to change about that. So they have that full connection to Israeli society. They do speak Hebrew. They, of course, are fluent in Arabic. They have the cultural connections with other Arab countries. Many of them, there are a lot of initiatives by the government, by various foundations, by various companies to try to get them the training and the education and the high-tech skills that make them, allow them to participate more in the Israeli high-tech economy. If you think about them as a bridge to not just the societies of countries that have already normalized, but the countries that have not yet normalized. The opportunity for them and the opportunity for the contribution they can make is really quite tremendous. But I do think it's early days, and we haven't seen that fully blossom the way I hope it will. I know some people in that community as well who I'm recruiting to do some work with me because I think that voice needs to be uplifted in this story.
And when you talk about the younger generation, it's not only about these Arab countries learning about Israel, but it's actually about Israelis learning about these countries. Any real-life data, whether you're hearing about Israelis going to these countries and actually opening up their mind in terms of what's happening in the Arab society today? You mentioned your work with the Arab Spring. How does maybe the events of the Arab Spring compare to the events of the Arab world of the countries that are actually working with the Abraham Accords in Israel?
I mean, that's part of what's so inspiring about this moment, that the connections, cultural, historical, religious, culinary, between these societies are now being explored and being drawn out much more in the open. And there's the narrative among younger Arabs is there's something very natural about Arabs and Israelis or Muslims and Jews working together, living together, studying together, something that actually has happened for centuries in the Middle East, not always without difficulty, but often as neighbors and as friends and as colleagues. So there's no reason it shouldn't happen now, and there's a great deal of curiosity. And you certainly are seeing some of that on the Israeli side as well. Of course, Israelis are bold travelers, and the minute there's an opportunity to go somewhere they have. Hundreds of thousands have traveled to the UAE. In fact, when I was there last week, there was a massive Haredi wedding, Lubavitch wedding in Abu Dhabi, which I was able to attend. And there was, of course, the pride of this Chabad family and their extended community explaining the traditions of their wedding, and I watched the conversations take place at the groom's tish between local Emiratis and the visiting Lubavitch families, and the Arabs were telling about their weddings and about their stories and how similar some of what they were seeing was. In Bahrain, which I was also in last week, of course, I visited the synagogue of the small Bahraini community, once numbered, I think at its height, maybe 3,500 or so, mostly Iraqi Jews who had migrated there as traders. And it's now down to a few dozen, but the synagogue is there. It's been restored. The Ten Commandments are on are on both sides of the Aron Kodesh, in Hebrew on one side and in Arabic on the other side. Maybe the only place in the world the Ten Commandments are posted in Arabic. And of course, many Israelis are going to have that experience and see what was the Jewish story and how was it that this Jewish community, which really feels very Bahraini. In fact, the former U.S. ambassador Bahraini ambassador to the United States is a Jewish woman, Hoda Nonu. Right. How is it that they felt this connection and felt at home and were able to thrive in this Arab community? So the opportunities for learning are both ways, not to mention Morocco, which I was in a couple of weeks ago, which we all know nearly 1 million Israelis trace their family history to Morocco, and there's still a small community there. So there's many opportunities to explore those connections.
And so these are Israelis sort of being exported that way. What about the Arab countries bringing their citizens to Israel to see what's on the ground? Is that a possibility? And how do you see them going back home saying it's not what you see on TV?
It's a much slower process, much smaller numbers. Of course, the countries, some of them are small. The UAE and Bahrain have only 1 million or 2 million citizens of their own. They have many more non-citizens who live there, but much smaller than the Israeli population. Morocco's got a larger population, but we haven't seen a significant amount of travel yet from those countries. It is being encouraged. When the Negev Summit was convened last March, this was the gathering in Israel that Secretary of State Blinken attended with 4 Arab foreign ministers, hosted by then Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, which was a breakthrough of its own. They created 6 working groups, which are now being institutionalized to develop actionable projects that can really have an impact on the lives of the citizens of the countries that have normalized. And one of those working groups is tourism. There's 2 aspects to that. One is getting those countries to work together so they all benefit from external tourism. So Americans or Europeans or others who will come to the region will not just come to one country, but will make it part of a regional tour. So that instead of just going to Egypt or just going to the Gulf, you also go to Israel. Instead of just going to Israel, you go to Morocco and you go to some of the other countries. But it's also internal tourism. As I said, the Israelis don't wait for an initiative, they do it. But Arabs coming to Israel, need to know they'll feel welcome, they'll feel safe. They read and still hear about violence or other things that happen. They don't necessarily know the geography and what it'll be like in Tel Aviv, depending on what they've heard is happening in the West Bank or in Gaza. Right. So there's some education to be done, but I think there's a market for it, and I think there's interest, certainly from those I met on visiting all of these countries I heard, of a lot of that curiosity. We'd really like to see this Israel that we're hearing so much about.
Probably decreased tourism in South America, right? Because now all the Israelis are in UAE. I want to go back to maybe just a difficult point in terms of the administration that you worked with, the Obama administration, as they were finishing, and that was at the United Nations. No surprise when, obviously, Senator Kerry spoke out, not vetoing the resolution. Maybe you can just address that in terms of what you were thinking at that moment and how that either did or didn't affect the accords going forward.
Sure. It's a very long story, which we wouldn't have time for all of it. The short version is I did, and I've said this publicly, I did recommend that we veto that resolution. I didn't agree with the text of it, and I didn't think it would achieve anything. It was so late in the administration, we clearly weren't going to get another negotiation underway at that point. My understanding was very much that President Obama didn't seek this situation out. After the election, when President Trump won, he was not looking to start new battles on this issue or really any issue. He was looking to consolidate the things he had already achieved. The Palestinians saw there might be an opportunity, because settlements was always a point of some contention, to try to get using some U.S. language, a resolution through. Israel, there was a lot of post-Trump election excitement and some action to normalize or to legalize a settlement, even talk of annexation. Probably a little premature, because Trump wasn't president yet. It wasn't the best backdrop for that when that decision had to be made. In any case, the resolution was offered, a decision had to be made, a judgment call. My judgment, my recommendation was to veto it. At least I read in the Washington Post, I can't speak to its accuracy, but I think there's a pretty good chance it's true, that then Vice President Biden also recommended a veto. The judgment call that the president made, and I guess Secretary supported, was to abstain on the resolution, not because they were so in love with the resolution, but because they were a little concerned about seeming to give an imprimatur to settlement expansion and maybe the two-state solution sort of dying on their watch. I would have made a different judgment call. As to the impact it had, I think its impact was actually pretty minor. There was a lot of upset at the time in our community. Certainly, I had a very tough conversation with Prime Minister Netanyahu on the weekend of my daughter's bat mitzvah. But, that's a ambassador's job, so no hard feelings. He had every right. But when I think about, what impact that resolution has had, it's really quite limited. There have been dozens of such resolutions over the decades passed by the UN. They mostly say more or less the same thing. Some are, this one actually was not as harsh about Israel in some respects, but it landed on the same point that changes of boundaries will be recognized only through negotiations. That doesn't mean Israel won't always have full control of the Kotel and other holy sites. I think that's obvious. But frankly, once the resolution was done and behind us, one has never really heard of it again. It certainly has had no impact on the ground. Palestinians have had no ability to capitalize on it, to move anything forward. It has no enforcement mechanism, no sanctions in it. When President Biden went to Israel 2 months ago, this was not on the agenda. No Israeli official said to him, hey, we really got to fix that resolution from 6 years ago. They've long since moved past it. And it clearly didn't do anything to prevent Arab states from moving forward, those who've chosen to, with normalization, simply because there was this resolution in the background. So I did disagree with it. I did counsel a veto. A different judgment call was made. I don't think it was the worst thing that's ever happened, but it was not the happiest note to end my ambassadorship on. But I think the impact has been quite limited.
And so going to the, not the elephant in the room, but the deal. And the Iran deal, we spoke about it a little earlier. Where does this fit in terms of the Abraham Accords? And do you see this affecting the Abraham Accords going forward, whichever way this goes or not?
Well, the Iran deal, obviously, or the Iran issue, the threat Iran poses through its pursuit of nuclear weapons, its sponsorship of multiple terrorist organizations around the region that target Israel and that target the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and the government in Iraq, and try to take control of Lebanon and Syria. It poses a huge threat, not just to Israel, but to many of its Arab neighbors, and that has been a magnetic force that has pulled them closer together. Again, even before normalization, there was lots of quiet security coordination. It is probably true that the majority of them disagreed with the Iran deal when it was struck in 2015. Some even appreciated the way Prime Minister Netanyahu fought publicly, including in his speech in Congress against it. A backhanded compliment I've heard of President Obama is that maybe the deal had the effect of pulling Arabs and Israelis closer together. But with or without the deal, I think that process was likely. Today, they're similarly aligned, trying to argue to the administration against the Iran deal. And that's understandable. At the same time, it wasn't necessary for them to move forward with normalization. Normalization, again, they didn't need normalization to cooperate on that issue. Normalization represents building on other opportunities for trade, for technology, for people-to-people relations. But maybe as a collective, creating themselves as a coalition that forms a bulwark against Iranian influence, not just its nuclear program, but its influence to try to change the narrative of the region in its favor. So to that degree, there is a connection between the two. Where there's a difference, however, is what to do if the deal fails. Israel is pretty clear that they don't want the deal to happen, and after that they want a military option on the table, their own, an American military option. Of course, if there's no deal, we will be faced with Iran as a nuclear threshold state in perpetuity. Very dangerous situation, and we'll all have to figure out how to deal with that. The Arab states are very nervous about that. They're closer to Iran, right across the Persian Gulf, or the Arabian Gulf as they call it. They believe rightly that they are in Iran's sights and maybe the first targets, and so they are trying not to provoke Iran. Even as they criticize Iran, they do diplomatic outreach. The Saudis have sent envoys. The UAE is returning an ambassador to Tehran after several years without one. And they are not they don't like the idea that they will be seen as part of a military coalition against Iran. They don't like the idea that an American or an Israeli attack might be associated with them or seem to come from their territory or their waters. When President Biden traveled to the region in July, before he left, there was a lot of discussion about an integrated air defense, linking Israeli Iron Dome and other missile defense systems and the U.S. systems in the Gulf and radars across the region so that all the countries could help protect each other from rockets or missiles launched from Iran or from the proxies. It's a great idea. And as soon as he got out there, the air sort of went out that balloon because the Saudis and the Emiratis didn't want to put on the table the idea that they were somehow in a military alliance against Iran. So even though they share the sense of threat, and that has been a force pulling them together, it's not necessarily true that they'll always agree on the best way to handle the threat depending on how it evolves.
So over the day, I've heard you talk a lot about sort of making the choice of two bad choices, whether it's Iran and also in terms of Saudi Arabia as well. So I want to ask a Saudi Arabia question, then we're going to get to these questions as well. Saudi Arabia, in terms of their relationship with Turkey and the infamous or famous fist bump by Biden, whether that was a COVID fist bump or not. But how does that fit in? Last week we asked if we were going to say L'shana haba bi Yirad habniyar. Are we going to sit in a rebuilt Riyadh? what is the importance of Saudi Arabia either sort of putting their foot in the game, Abraham Accords, or doing small things to show them that we're dancing together?
Saudi Arabia is part of this shift. There's no question. I mentioned Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, is a different thinker. He's very modern in his thinking in some ways. He's willing to break with past positions. He seems clearly to view Israel, he has said this publicly, as a potential partner and opportunity. He also obviously continues to, he's done a lot of important social changes in Saudi Arabia. Women are driving, women are working, and men and women are socializing together in ways that really were unthinkable just a few years ago. At the same time, he's been quite brutal to people he perceives as political opponents. Of course, the Khashoggi murder hangs heavily over this story. It's still not exactly clear which version of him will move forward. But as to the possibility of normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, it's on the table. When President Biden went, he consolidated. It took a lot of hard work and a lot of diplomacy, a Saudi decision to allow Israeli overflights or flights of any airline flying over Saudi airspace to and from Israel. That is not the same as an embassy. That is not the same as full recognition or commerce or trade or tourism, but it's an important and very public step that seems to be clearly on the road toward what the Crown Prince is likely to do when he is king, assuming he becomes king. His father's quite aged. That said, and it's also likely that other countries, the UAE and even more so Bahrain, would not have taken the step they did without some signal that the Saudis supported it, and see them as kind of the first movers in something that will take place later. If and when Saudi Arabia does this, it will have enormous influence. Their influence not just in the Arab world, but in the Muslim world, because they're the custodians of the two holiest sites in Islam, will reshape fundamentally the thinking of many Arabs and Muslims about the timing and the willingness to do this. So some Arab states may be holding back to wait and see what the Saudis do, and the Saudis may be holding back because they may think they would get more in a transactional sense from a Republican administration in 2025, if there is one, than they might get from the Biden administration right now. But the Biden administration is working on this issue. Again, one important step was taken. I don't think it's going to be the last step that will happen on their watch. And it's very important that we all work to make that normalization happen.
So questions from our audience tonight. Was Bibi invited to your daughter's bar mitzvah after that meeting? No, but it does say, what was your personal relationship with Bibi during your term, given the tensions that at least we saw publicly between Bibi and Obama, when you're on the ground really being that the middleman?
My personal relationship was really excellent. We got to know each other when I was working in the White House the first 2.5 years of the administration. I was traveling to Israel almost every month, either with George Mitchell or on my own or as part of other delegations. So I spent a fair bit of time with him and his team. They saw me, I think it's fair to say, as a friend and as a trustworthy actor and as someone who was always trying to make good things happen in this relationship. I was one of the leaders of the negotiation that led to the funding of Iron Dome when it first was possible to do so. And worked on many other security partnership arrangements, and even on the issues we had some disagreements on. I tried very much to be a problem solver. So he saw me in that light. We met frequently. I saw him several times a month. He was honest with me about his views, both when we agreed and disagreed. He had no problem with me doing the same. He was very kind to my family on a number of occasions, and we hosted him and his family in our home. So the relationship was really quite good, as one hopes it would be, between an ambassador and the host head of state. But we did have moments of disagreement, for sure. Frequently, it was when my bosses were in town. So if John Kerry was in town, he was the one who had to have the argument, not me. But then Kerry would leave and I would have the argument. Obviously, the Iran deal was a source of significant disagreement. We knew that. We were open and honest about it. When when the deal finally was struck, of course, he had already given the speech in Congress, the deal was struck, Congress approved it, and then it was done. And then I went to see him in the fall of 2015 to help prepare his next meeting with Obama, because, of course, we still had a year plus to go in the Obama administration. There was work to do. There was a security package to negotiate. There was dealing with the non-nuclear threats that Iran could advance with the sanctions relief money, weapons flowing to Syria. And he and I worked together to prepare that visit, and it ended up being actually one of the most successful meetings that Obama and Netanyahu had, even though it was right after this big, major public disagreement. The bat mitzvah story is the resolution actually passed on a Friday morning in New York as we were going into Shabbat for my daughter's bat mitzvah. I was pretty much out of commission for that next 24 hours. And obviously he was not happy about the resolution, but I didn't hear about it till Shabbat was over. Sunday morning, I get a phone call from the Prime Minister's office saying, the Prime Minister would like to see you. And I said, well, I'm always available to see the Prime Minister. When would he like to see me? They said, Tuesday afternoon. I said, no problem, I'll be there. About 30 minutes later, the secretary called back and she said, the Prime Minister would like to see you today, now. Well, I was out with the kids and with families. I had to drop everybody off at home and go up to Jerusalem. And I did, of course. I'm always available to see the Prime Minister. It was not an easy conversation. He was obviously very unhappy about the resolution. And although I disagreed with the resolution, my position was to represent the decision that the administration had taken and to correct some misimpressions I think he had. Anyway, that's an ambassador's job, is sometimes to take those hard conversations, but no hard feelings.
The question is, what were the sentiments of your colleagues within the Obama administration as the next administration of the Trump struck peace?
Well, I don't want to speak for anybody else. I mean, I'll speak for myself. I was no fan of the Trump administration. I've said it publicly, tweeted it publicly. There's no, I think, any mystery about my views about him as a president or much of what happened in the administration. But I fully supported the success that they helped shepherd, and there were many reasons for it. But it happened on their watch. They certainly get their share of credit for it. And think that the fact that it happened under administration I otherwise had many disagreements with in no way should prevent me or anybody, any American, from embracing it as a major achievement, a fulfillment of a bipartisan commitment to help get Israel the recognition it deserves, as any country deserves, and to build on it in a way that advances American interests in the region. I was advising the Biden campaign at the time that the UAE announcement came out in August, and it was a surprise. It was, to their credit, also things didn't leak as they were working on them. So now it's not always the case in my time. So it was announced very suddenly, and of course the Biden campaign had to respond very quickly to it. I worked on the statement that came out, and I'd say in under 2 hours, the candidate, Biden, put out a statement in his name, fully endorsing it. And it may be the only time in that whole campaign that he had something positive to say about a Trump administration initiative. He said, this is a fulfillment of a bipartisan commitment. This is in our interest. I will work to expand it. I will work to get other countries to sign up to it. I will try to harness it in positive ways for the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as well. And no ifs, ands, or buts about it. I think it was exactly the right way to respond. Did every single person in the Democratic foreign policy establishment get the memo? I suppose probably it takes a little time for that to wash through the system. And that may be why things got off to a little bit of a slow start the first few months of the administration, in addition to the other huge crises, climate, COVID, China, other major issues that they were paying attention to. But within a few months, they were using the term Abraham Accords. They were, Secretary Blinken was going to the Negev Summit. President Biden put this very much on his agenda during his trip to the region. I think it's a settled question whether this is a fully bipartisan issue or not. It is.
This is an interesting question that's come up over the last couple lectures that we've had today as well, because we've spoken about the Middle East and the countries in the Gulf, but now Russia and Ukraine have come into the picture, which was not necessarily in the picture when the Abraham Accords were created. The question is that at first it seemed that Israel was forced to remain neutral in terms of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. And somebody said this earlier today, is it because of the Russian Jews that are still there, or how does that piece work? But what do you see first as the Israeli-Ukraine relationship, and then also as the Israeli-Russian relationship going in the future? And how does that fit into this Accord process?
Sure. Well, Israel has had understandable reasons to be very cautious about how it approaches this crisis. First of all, it has had good relations with both Ukraine and Russia before the crisis. Actually, my daughter goes to school at the American school with the son of the Ukrainian ambassador, whose family's obviously going through a hard time, but the ambassador there is a very popular figure, very welcome, and even before the war started, was somebody who had an excellent relationship with the Israelis. But Israel, as I said, has reason to be cautious. Two reasons. One is that Russia controls the skies of Syria, and Israel has been able to conduct hundreds, perhaps over 1,000 raids in Syria against Iranian weapons shipped into Syria, either to target Israel from Syria or on their way to Lebanon to Hezbollah's hands. And that has been made possible by a very shrewd and effective diplomatic and then military deconfliction effort that has been undertaken between Israel and Russia. Russia could make that a lot more difficult if they wanted to. I'm not sure they could prevent Israel completely, but they could certainly make it more complicated, and they have chosen not to do that. And Israel would like to make sure that they continue to have that freedom of action in Syria. The other reason, as you mentioned, is the Jewish community in Russia, which generally has not been targeted by the Putin government, but always lives, as anybody does in Russia, a little bit uncomfortably, that if they're on the wrong side of Putin, bad things can happen. And indeed, just in the last month or two, as Russia has felt Israel has been leaning a little bit too much in the correct direction of Ukraine, they've shut down the offices of the Jewish Agency on some legal pretext. That will make it much more difficult for Russians who choose to make Aliyah and leave Russia to Russian Jews to do so. So they have good reasons to be careful. That said, they also have the United States, their closest ally, placing this as its highest foreign policy priority to reverse the Russian invasion, the unjustified and unprovoked invasion of a sovereign state, to ensure that Ukraine survives and can ultimately repel that and win. It's difficult to walk between the raindrops when something is this clear between right and wrong. Maybe at the beginning and maybe in the early days, one could try to avoid taking a position. Prime Minister Bennett at the time even tried a brief negotiation to see if he could sort of help bring it to an end. But it's long since past the point where it's a deluge, and right and wrong is very, very clear in this case. Israel, which sees itself firmly in the camp of democratic nations, has gradually increased the kinds of assistance it's given Ukraine. First it was humanitarian and medical assistance. Now it's some defensive equipment as well. They still would prefer not to provide equipment that might actually result in Russian deaths. But I think the trend is moving in that direction. But this is a moment. Some of the Arab states too, because of their own relationships with Russia, have sort of wavered a bit. The UAE sits on the UN Security Council and initially abstained on a resolution condemning the Russian invasion, and others abstained on a UN General Assembly resolution. And I think this is a moment when, as this coalition of Arab and Israeli actors pulls together to become a really cohesive group in the Middle East, it's important that the United States be the key partner to the emergence of that coalition, and as the key partner, make clear to those partners that we expect them to ensure that they align themselves with U.S. interests, at least when our most important interests are threatened, whether that's by Russia or whether that's by China. These are tough conversations, but they will only be made tougher if we are not at the table showing that we're making our security commitments to those countries and then in return expecting their partnership.
So two things you said, one about walking in between the raindrops, and then Israel sees itself as a democratic country. A hot topic in rabbinical school is, can Israel be a Jewish democratic state with a two-state solution next to it? This question is from online. We're a hybrid audience. So is there a future for Israel as a Jewish democratic state with the two-state solution in side by side?
Well, I think a two-state solution is necessary for many reasons. It's the only actual end to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Of course, it has to be met with all of the necessary features of security protections for Israel and proper access to holy sites and no right of return and these types of things. But in the absence of a two-state solution, of course, Palestinians won't achieve their legitimate aspirations for and rights for freedom in a state of their own. But Israel will see its future as a Jewish democratic state jeopardized, which, by the way, is bad for the United States. But it's bad for Israel. It's bad for Zionism. Zionism always contained within it the tension between Israel as both a Jewish and a democratic state. And it has been both, and it can be both. But it's very difficult to be both if it doesn't have a very significant Jewish majority population. And it does within the borders of Israel from 1967. I don't expect ever those borders to be exactly replicated. There are certainly communities across the Green Line which would be swapped and retained by Israel in any kind of settlement. But if Israel maintains control over all of that territory, and those Palestinian citizens those Palestinian residents would be given the rights of citizenship, suddenly the democratic balance changes dramatically, and it may not be a Jewish state much longer, or if they're not, then we have in perpetuity something not democratic, not in all of Israel, but in the territory it controls in the West Bank. And so for a long, and of course many younger Palestinians are saying two states is over, it's dead, it's my parents' dream, all I want is the rights of citizenship. Just
Many Palestinians
many young
are saying
Palestinians
that.
are
Can you
saying
expand on that?
Yeah, many young Palestinians say, all we want is one entity with equal rights between the river and the sea. And, that's sort of, hard to argue with in some sense because, why shouldn't anybody have the same rights? The way to prevent that is the creation of a two-state solution. I think this will actually be, over time, an important dialogue between Israel and its new Arab partners. Now, when the UAE and Bahrain and Morocco say to Israel, we believe in you, we want to be your partner, we believe you should exist as a Jewish state, you have every right to do so. We also believe that Palestinians have rights, and we want to see that realized or at least preserved as an option. It may take different Palestinian leaders, we don't even know their names yet, to actually do what they need to do on their side. I do think that will have some influence on the Israeli public and government's perceptions of how it should act. So two states is not easy. It's not, some people say it's not even possible anymore. I believe it is possible with the right kind of political leadership on both sides. I think we're in a moment, the Biden administration isn't trying to get a negotiation going on that, and I think that's the right decision. There isn't the recipe to do that or the ingredients to do that among the leaders on both sides or even the publics on both sides. But keeping it alive is possible, necessary, and ultimately to keep Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. The reason I say that's important in the United States is that definition of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state is core to the common values relationship that we base our security partnership on. First, we are two countries that share values, and on top of that, we build the security partnership. If we reach a point when too many Americans say, it's not both Jewish and democratic, or it's no longer democratic, I think it will be harmful for our own interests in the closeness of the partnership we've been able to enjoy.
So you actually answered the question. You said, we don't even know the name of that next Palestinian leader that can actually sit at the table. Why won't Abbas designate a successor? And what will happen when his life on earth is no longer?
I'm often asked about Palestinian succession, and I say I think it's the biggest black box in the Middle East. Nobody knows, first of all, when this transition will take place, because it's probably an actuarial question. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like there will be an election of any kind there. And no one knows what's going to happen or who's going to succeed him. Everybody can name 6 or 8 or 10 scenarios or candidates among the people around Abbas who could succeed him. Most of them are not people who are likely to be transformational people because they're of the same generation, maybe the same way of thinking, so maybe they're transitional to something else. There are certainly very bad scenarios that could devolve into chaos, that could evolve in Hamas trying to take over parts of the West Bank that, of course, Israel would not permit, but then Israel may get drawn into parts of the Palestinian Authority's territory it has not been in for decades, does not want to be in. So there's some bad scenarios, and then there are the slightly better but not so hopeful scenarios of just kind of more status quo and drift. So we don't know who it is, but it's probably a second change of leadership before we see a different generation, people who really are willing to challenge essentially the failures of this generation of Palestinian leaders and say, we have to do this differently. We have to show the Israeli public we, A, totally reject violence, B, recognize that Israel has legitimacy to be here. We can link that to what's happening in the Abraham Accords and show that our own people actually will benefit more by that approach than what the approach they've been on.
Could you imagine somebody of Palestinian descent right now living in one of those countries of the Abraham Accords coming back to those people and saying, we did it outside, can you come inside and do this too?
Well, it's not implausible in the sense that there is a prominent and in some cases very successful Palestinian diaspora in some of those countries, in some ways influenced by those countries. But it's difficult if you've been outside for a long time to come back in and assert leadership and challenge those who have been on the inside. Of course, there's one particular name that is associated with that question, Mohammed Dahlan, a former associate of Abbas and even Arafat, was the security chief in Gaza during the early Oslo years, even worked with the U.S. He now lives in the UAE. He's very close to the UAE leadership. He's considered a bitter rival of Abbas, but he has friends and he has people who kind of are his people on the inside. I think it would be a hard thing to imagine, someone from the outside coming back in and taking over, but that scenario is sometimes mentioned as a possibility.
So the last question, we're sitting here just a couple of days before Rosh Hashanah. This sanctuary will be packed. What's the message to the Jewish people from the land of Israel about the year ahead, and what should we look forward to?
Well, first of all, wish everybody a sweet and fulfilling and healthy new year. That's the most important thing. It is a year of real possibility to take what has already happened over the last 2 years and build on it, to see much deeper connections drawn that really deliver meaningful benefits to the citizens of these countries across all the different domains that these societies can now work together in commerce and in tourism and in health and in education and water and agriculture technology. It is an opportunity to help, and everybody in our community can do this, build these connections by traveling to the UAE, to Bahrain, to Morocco, maybe to other Arab countries. Everyone in our community has friends and family in Israel and can help build those connections ourselves, sponsor different sorts of exchanges. And it's an opportunity for new countries that have not yet taken this step to realize, as they see the benefits others are experiencing, that they want to be part of that club. So there's work to do on the Israeli side. Of course, they got to get through their election first. There's work to do on the American side and in the American Jewish community side, working with Israelis, working with Arab states. So it's a year that, despite all the challenges we face, and we face many, I'm actually fairly optimistic about, at least in this dimension. And so I wish everybody a year of hatzlacha and success and health and happiness, and maybe this can be part of that.
Amen. I'm going to wish everybody a Shana Tova. We're really honored that Ambassador Shapiro literally traveled from the state of Israel to be with us this evening, just one night in LA, specifically here at Sinai Temple and the Sinai Temple Israel Center. Again, thank you to all of our partners, and Osei Shalom. We pray that God who brings peace to heaven should bring peace to here as well.
Amen.
Have a wonderful evening.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.